I have had the Sony A1 for a year now, and here are my thoughts after using it full time for a year. So we bought the Sony A1 last year to replace my Sony A7R III that I use for my business and the Sony A9 II that I use out here for cattail chronicles, bird photography, wildlife, nature. The A9 II was awesome, but with the A7R III it was slower, so I just needed something that could kind of combine everything together, and the A1 was what we landed on. Now, what I typically shoot, because I said I'm full-time, is I have a whole separate studio that is portrait and pet photography and videography. And so I needed something that would photograph fast-moving dogs and animals too, and people. And then I also needed it out here for all the videos you see on Cattail Chronicles, where it's kind of the passion work, where photographing the birds and the wildlife and all the cool places in Colorado. I'm here with my husband, Steve, who happens to be just standing behind the camera right now because he didn't get a chance to really use the Sony A1 this year. Yeah, he has his Sony A7R IV. So if you ever want a comparison video of the A1 versus A7R IV, we could try to put that together for you. But he really didn't have hands on this camera much at all, partly because I think he would have really wanted it. He's laughing behind the camera. But I do have some pros and cons if you're considering this camera for any of the above things. So let's get into that, what I thought of this camera after a year, the Sony A1. All right, I started with the pros. There's a lot to love about this camera. There really is. The first one I have on here is it's a perfect file size with 51 megapixels. 50 is perfect. I've been loving the megapixel size. I can crop in if I need to, and the files aren't too ginormous. So I'm loving the file size of the A1. Oh, another thing I really love is the IAF, because I've got one of my buttons set to have animal, bird, or human IAF, and it is good. It is really good. When I'm photographing something small or dark, it still grabs. So I've been loving the IAF. There are a ton of focus features in this camera. There is spot, and then there's spot tracking, and there's zone, and there's so many that I've really been having fun exploring all of those settings. So I'm loving all the eye autofocus features. And I love how fast it focuses. Now here's kind of the problem, is that it's not focuses, but how fast it takes pictures. So it takes pictures super fast. You could fill up your card like in an hour for sure. But what's nice is it has the high, medium, low, and high plus. So you could take the 30 frames per second if you want, but I often find I back it down because you're gonna like fill up your hard drive with stuff. But if it's a super fast moving subject, like maybe you have an eagle flying right in front of you and you have that chance to get all these different looks, I put it on the high mode. If it's something where it's kind of standing still, maybe the elk that we photographed, I put it on low because I don't need 10,000 tiny different pictures. So I'm loving it, but it's almost like too fast sometimes. But I'm gonna put it on the pro list, okay? I have been shocked at handheld video. I can actually hand hold this. Now my last camera, the A7R III, could not do that. I have a gimbal for that type of work, but I needed just like one shot for a commercial I was shooting that was gonna be handheld. Either that or I had to like manipulate my tripod into this weird position for 2 seconds of video. And so I tested it out and it worked. And I did handheld video. This was with my smaller lens, a 17 to 28. With this camera, it was amazing, so smooth, could not believe it. All the video that I do with this camera out on this channel for wildlife is handheld. I just hate being tied down by a tripod. I don't like it. So I have found, even with this big lens, that I can handhold it. Mark Smith Photography can do the same thing, so it's possible. But ooh, it's nice and smooth on the Sony A1. Love it. So there is touchscreen on here, and I don't use it all the time because I don't want to accidentally press the touchscreen, but sometimes on playback, it's kind of nice because you can actually swipe through your photos and you can enlarge them with your fingers. You can do the pinch to zoom instead of just enlarging it with the buttons. So I've kind of liked that every once in a while where I just want to hurry up and just look really quick at that. I will use the touchscreen feature. So it's nice to have it there as something I can use as an alternative to the buttons. Okay, the next one is ergonomics. Now, some of the Sony cameras, especially the mirrorless line, the beauty of those is that they've made them smaller, but some of them they've made too small. And I don't have very big hands, but even at that, like the Sony A7R III was just a little small. And so when I hold this, the grip is just a little bit deeper and it's a little bit more molded. It's much more comfortable and ergonomic to hold this camera. And I will often hold it just like this with my hand under the tripod foot and my elbows up against me, and it works beautifully. I really love the ergonomics that they built into the Sony A1. The next one is all the buttons can be programmed. Now I can program them for still mode, and I can program them all differently for video mode, which I'm not going to get into today, but I have programmed all of these very similar to Mark Smith's photography. And I don't even have to move my camera from in front of my face. I know that the front button is for the f-stop, the back button is for shutter speed, the back wheel is for ISO, and I also have buttons set where C2 is for what type of focus I want to use. C1 is for white balance. C3 back here is for my star rating. If I see a picture I especially like, I press the C3 and Lightroom will see that star. And then I also have the wheel back here. If I push it down, it'll go to the different IAF, animal, human, and bird. So I've programmed these all where I don't even have to move it from my face. And I know you can do that on all the Sony cameras too, but it seemed really, really easy and intuitive to set up for the A1. And I highly suggest it because it's so frustrating if you're out on location and you're like, oh, how do I change like something simple like the white balance? You have to go into the menus. So I suggest you set up all the buttons, and it's really nice to do that on the Sony A1. And then the last pro that I really like that Steve had to remind me of is there's no blackout. So unfortunately on his A7R IV, and we've done a video about this, we couldn't remember, but yes, there is a tiny moment of blackout between frames. So that's a plus, so you know you're actually shooting, but it really messes with my mind to have that blackout. I don't like the blackout between frames. If I'm not sure if it really shot, then I just do play back really quickly. But I love the no blackout between pictures. It really speeds up my workflow and it doesn't feel so jarring. So those are all like the pros of the Sony A1. You've probably seen a lot of videos about the A1, and there's a lot, even more great things. But this is from my experience as a portrait and a wildlife photographer, what I've loved about this. But aren't there some cons, Monique? Yes, and unfortunately there is. And some of them are kind of littler ones. But one I hadn't foreseen when I first got this was all of my lenses, I needed to update the firmware. So if you saw my past video about my original 70-200 lens, it was not working correctly. And I just could not figure out why. And as soon as I updated the firmware of the lens, it worked fine with the camera. So if you're having any lens trouble, it could be that you need to update the firmware of the lens itself. And Sony has great documentation online on how to do that. If we're talking about firmware updates, one of the cons that I think is that to do a firmware update, which I just did on the camera itself, you have to plug it into your computer and download the package and do everything in this very particular order, like plug in the USB and then turn it on and then do this and then do that. And it's very nerve-wracking. I wish it could be, I'm pretty sure other brands do this. I think my Nikon used to. You just put the firmware update on an SD card, pop the SD card in there, and the camera does it. I wish they would have a more streamlined way to update the firmware because it seems scary. And so I put it off, or I just don't ever remember to do it. So I wish that was a little bit better on the Sony A1 and honestly all the Sony cameras. One thing I've noticed with my studio work is I'm having a hard time with my strobes. This may not apply to you if you're doing wildlife and nature, but if you're doing anything with studio flashes, the way that the contacts are on the top of, in the hot shoe here, all the contacts are in the front here. So you have to make sure your flash or your controller is all the way seated very securely and doesn't bump around at all, because you will lose connection. So that can be really infuriating, where I think it's on there all the way and then my flashes aren't behaving correctly. So that is something that's been frustrating. Another one that I don't have much for my wildlife and nature photography is it does overheat if you are doing a long amount of video. So commercial video shoot I was on, I was filming at 4K and it was outside, it was getting a little bit warmer. We tried to do it as early in the morning as possible, but just being a little bit warmer outside and trying to get longer clips, it overheated within 2 hours. These were only less than 5-minute clips at a time, and then we'd change location and film another piece, and that's with a monitor on it. So I am a little upset that there's overheating when you're doing a longer production, you're just doing video, but it's been fine for other clips. You've seen a lot of clips here on this channel of maybe birds and other wildlife that are clearly taken with the big camera, and those 30-second to 3-minute videos are totally fine. And obviously half the year it's cold here anyway, but do be careful if you're doing longer video in the heat, it'll probably overheat on you. So if you have any fixes for that too, please let me know in the comments. And then the last one really is just a flippy screen. I'm a little disappointed that this is their highest end camera like this. This was a very expensive camera. That's probably one of the cons. And it only has this screen, a tilty screen, just a tilty screen. Like, what? And it feels like just after this came out, they came out with, what is it, the A7 IV? And it has the full flip out screen like the little video camera I'm using. It's such a bummer. Like, that wouldn't have been too difficult for them to build in, make this go out to the side as well. I do really wish it had that. You know how it is when you're out here photographing wildlife, you're on the ground. You're on the ground, you're under things, you're on top of things. Like, there's so many things that would be great, and they really should have built it into this camera. So that's a little bit disappointing, but nothing that's a deal breaker, really, because I've found workarounds. But that is my overall impressions. I'm a fast talker, I hope you took notes, of the Sony A1 after using it for a year for my portrait and video clients, and out here on location for wildlife, nature, birds, probably a lot of the things that you're photographing as well. And the cons aside, I do think overall this is an amazing camera, and I would definitely recommend it if it's in your budget. But Sony, all their cameras are pretty good, and they keep coming out with new ones somehow. Just when we think like this is the best, and then they come out with a new one that has amazing features too. You know, we have other videos on this channel talking about the cameras, talking about this 200 to 600 lens. I invite you to check those out as well. We have a lot of different playlists for you to peruse. And that's what I think of the Sony A1 after a year. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye. I gotta go find some birds. Yeah.